The Gospels are not biographies. They are not history books in our understanding of the term history. And demonstrating that, my brothers and sisters, is very easy. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is crucified after Passover had begun on Friday, like we celebrate, Good Friday. After sharing Passover dinner with his inner circle, obviously after the lambs had been slaughtered, because you can't have Passover dinner without a lamb. By the way, it's not a Seder. That evolved later. In John, Jesus is crucified on Thursday, just before Passover begins, as the Passover lambs for the Passover meal are being slaughtered. Never saw that, did you? A modern historian from the United States or Canada or Europe somewhere would look at John and say, "What, dingbat, what is wrong with you? You can't keep the days of the week straight?" And that's not what's going on. John has a theology that Jesus is the Lamb of God slain for the sins of the world. To convey that theology, John presents the crucifixion happening on the day and time that the Judean families are at temple killing their Passover lambs. See? In other words, for John and the other biblical writers, the other gospel writers, history comes second. What comes first is theology. They freely rearrange history to serve their theologies. Here's another example. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus throws those SOB money changers out of the temple in the last week of his life. Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In fact, it's the event that Mark seems to suggest precipitates why he got killed. And that's probably it. They did away with him real quick after he went and over the line. He stepped over the line with that act. Last week of his life. And don't we kind of celebrate that the same way here in our liturgical cycles? Okay, but in John, cleansing the temple is the very first thing Jesus does in public right after the wedding at Cana, in the beginning of his career. And his career lasts another 3 years, really 3 dry seasons. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, only 1 dry season.
So what do they believe?
What to believe? We'll get to that. We're interested here in seeing what can we know? What are we sure of? Is it that John, Monique, has a historical problem? No. He's not writing history. Rather, it is this. The unnamed author of the document we call John hates Jerusalem, loathes the temple, and is disgusted by everything to do with the temple. So what does he do? He moves this event that was probably in the historical life of Jesus, the last week of his life, front and center, as if to say, this is what the Johannine Jesus is all about, baby. Overthrowing everything that has to do with that piece of temple. The Gospels are not 21st century Western historical accounts. They freely rearrange history, they borrow stories, they change the wording, they adapt things for their audience. The result of this is that of the 503 known Jesus sayings, there is really not much confidence among scholars about which comes from the historical Jesus and which comes from his later followers. The problem becomes even more difficult when we come to the actions of Jesus. In the Synoptic Gospels, the public career of Jesus is 1 year long, really 1 dry season. In John, it is 3 years long, really 3 dry seasons. Why? Mark produces a chronology of 1 dry season. Both Matthew and Luke follow that Markan chronology because they follow Mark. John does not follow that chronology at all. John doesn't know Mark, Matthew, or Luke, or Q. You see?
Can you tell me what you mean by dry season? I don't know.
Beautiful. Dry season, right, would be from more or less spring all the way to about September, and wet season. They don't really have winter, spring, summer, and fall. They don't have that. Kind of like us here in South Florida, except there it's more of a desert-like climate, a moderate desert. climate. That's another thing. Desert. We immediately think in the United States, Sahara. No, there's different kinds of deserts. Some are more moderate. Exactly how long was the public career of Jesus? We don't know. Matthew and Luke have genealogies that are not at all alike. In Matthew, the genealogy of Jesus has 42 names, and in Luke it has 67 names, and they're not all the same names. Both genealogies list two different paternal grandfathers. Come on, friends, that doesn't happen in reality. Neither one is likely historical. You only got a genealogy in the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean, after you died and became famous. If you died and resurrected, I'd say that makes you famous. So it's time to give them a genealogy. Maybe two. Both were written for theological reasons and honor reasons, not historical ones. Both Mark and John offer no genealogy whatsoever. That speaks volumes to scholars. Only the infancy narrative of Matthew chapter 1 and 2 tells of the slaughter of the innocents and the flight into Egypt. Recall, King Herod the Great is going to kill all the boy babies. So the Holy Family flees down to Egypt land. Does that story sound familiar? The people of God are suffering in the promised land, which we call Israel, and they go to Egypt, and a king threatens to kill all the boy babies. What is that? Where is that? Where have I heard that story before?
Moses.
Do you remember that same story being told about anybody else? It was told about Moses. Told about Moses, lived 1,400 years before Jesus. But what if I told you this story was told about somebody else 2,000 years before Moses? How many of us here can honestly say that the same story was also told about Sargon the Great 2,000 years before Moses? Hey, what's given? What does this mean? It begins to look like that this is a stock story in the repertoire of stories from the ancient Near East. That storytellers can haul out anytime they want when they want to make a point. Matthew is the only writer in the New Testament who tells this story. No other early Jesus group writer mentions it. So scholars begin to ask, how does this story fit Matthew's theological agenda? It turns out that it does. Matthew's trying to present Jesus as the new Israel and as the new Moses. So what Matthew does is plop in a Moses story right into the text. Did that actually happen to the historical baby Jesus, folks? No. No. Is it true? Yes, it is true. Theologically, it is true. Jesus is the new Moses. Jesus is the new Israel. So it is true, and it never happened. Look on the wall there. The Bible is all true, and some of it actually happened. Jesus was, for the Matthean community and his Jesus group, the new and greater Israel and the new and greater Moses. Wouldn't it be silly to try to prove that this story actually happened when no other historical writer, including Josephus, mentions bodies being buried in a mass grave, killed? Even writers like Josephus, who hated Herod the Great and had a bone to pick with him and wrote of him really nasty stuff. Yes?
Do we know if the Jews see Moses, or if the Jews have that same account of Moses, that story might have been taken from, I'm blocking on the name now,
Sargon the Great?
Sargon the Great.
Jewish scholars like Shia Cohen and others will be able to tell you that, yes, because see, that's another thing, our Jewish brothers and sisters are a branch on a tree that is parallel to us. They're not earlier on the same branch. That's very important that we begin to understand this. When we talk about first century Israel, we are talking about a root to the branches Islam, Judaism, 500 Common Era, Christianity, 325 Common Era. We're going to have to talk about that later on. But yes, Jewish scholars that are not fundamentalists, exposed to this kind of data, will be able to see absolutely parallels. In fact, much more freely, our Jewish brothers and sisters, much more freely. They freely are okay with fact. All facts are true and not all truths are facts, with their own traditions and their own scriptures. Matthew's particular use of the old story of Moses, which we can trace even further back in time to Sargon, says that it was pulled out by different writers at different times to make different points, and Matthew had his point to make. But this deepens our problem, doesn't it? How do we know which stories are borrowed or created, and which stories relate things that actually happened? That's not so easy to figure out. What I'm presenting to you is the problem. Matthew and Luke have stories of the virgin birth. No other New Testament writer mentions that. None! Paul doesn't mention that. If Paul actually believed that, how could he leave that out? Would you leave that out? If you were writing about somebody that you knew to be born of a virgin, would you leave that out? That begins to raise a very important question. How does the virgin birth fit the theological agendas of Matthew and Luke? Why did it not fit the theological agendas of people like Paul, the author of the book of Revelation, Hebrews, John, or Mark? Why was it so important to Matthew and to Luke? We know very, very little, folks. Very, very little that is historical about the birth and youth of Jesus. Some scholars think there may be some reasons to doubt he was born in Bethlehem. Others disagree. Historically, his parents were Mary and Joseph. What more can we be certain about that? Besides that, how can we be sure? We encounter difficulties also at the resurrection stories as well. They differ markedly. Matthew has an angel at the tomb greet the women. Mark has a young man. Luke has two men in dazzling apparel. Which was it? Is there a way to know for sure? In Matthew, the women run and tell the disciples, and Luke is similar to Matthew. In Mark, they are afraid and tell no one. Huh? Which is it? In Matthew, the risen Jesus himself comes and meets the disciples. Luke and Mark omit this. Matthew alone tells of bribing the soldiers. That story of bribing the soldiers just doesn't exist anywhere else in any of the early Jesus group's literature. Again, the question gets raised. Does that fit Matthew's theological agenda? After all, Matthew is writing a theological portrait and not a 21st century Western history. Luke alone has that wonderful story of the Emmaus journey, where two disciples meet the risen Jesus, whom they did not recognize, on the road to Emmaus. They invite him to dinner, and in the breaking of the bread, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Beautiful Eucharistic imagery. Huh? This is a wonderful sacramental story. Sharing the bread and wine and having your eyes open to experiencing Jesus' presence by the power of the Holy Spirit. Sounds familiar? Is it historical? Is it partly historical? Was it created from real experiences of the risen Lord? When you realize that ancient authors told stories as a means of conveying ideas, And they didn't tell stories simply to report the news of the day. Again, it raises the question, what is historical and what is not? The resurrection appearances stories differ also. In Matthew, all happen in Galilee. In Luke, all are in Jerusalem and nearby environs. In the original form of Mark, ending in chapter 16, verse 8, there were no appearances. In John, some appearances take place in Jerusalem, but one happens in Galilee, here.
No wonder why the judicial system is so screwed up.
Please. Let's look at this, friends. Johannine Jesus, the Jesus of the Gospel of John, versus the Jesus in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, Jesus is conscious of his pre-existence. Father, glorify me with the glory we shared before the world began. See, he remembers. A time before the world began. But in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus says nothing about pre-existing or a life before his earthly life. The Jesus we encounter in Mark, Matthew, and Luke seems to have no awareness of pre-existence. The Johannine Jesus presents a Jesus movement that's largely set in Jerusalem, lasts 3 dry seasons. But in the Synoptics, Jesus movement is largely set in Galilee, lasts 1 dry season. Only at the end does he go up to Jerusalem. The Johannine Jesus teaches in long-winded discourses and never parables. But the Synoptic Jesus teaches always in pithy proverbial sayings, one-liners, and proverbs. That's radically different, folks. The Johannine Jesus performs only 7 signs or works, some of which are nowhere to be found in the Synoptics. But in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus performs many mighty deeds, wonders, and marvels. You know, folks, there is only a meager 15.5% commonality between the Passion in the Gospel of John with the Passion according to Mark. That is a huge 84.5% difference between the Markan Passion and the Johannine Passion. Johannine Christology is the highest in the New Testament. The divine Jesus tells soldiers coming to arrest him, "Who are you looking for?" And "I am," and they all get knocked back, an army. Jesus instills fear in those coming to arrest him. And from the cross, the triumphant Johannine Jesus, totally in control, says, "Tetelestai, it is finished." Before he told us, "No one takes my life, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it up again. This command I have from my Father." That's a Jesus totally in charge. But in the Synoptics, Jesus prays in Gethsemane, very human. "Eloi, Eloi," from the cross. "Lema sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me?" And in Gethsemane, he prays that the cup be taken from me. That sounds like a very different Jesus. Hey, thanks for watching. Just continue the playlist for the next part of the study. If you have further questions, this is good. They will get addressed, so keep watching. If you found value, please subscribe, like, and share. As always, questions, comments, and criticisms are most welcome. God bless you.